The Buddha's take on sex and sensuality. As the Buddha commented one time, our reaction to suffering is twofold. One is bewilderment. Why is there this pain? Why is there this suffering? The second is a search. Is there someone who knows a way out of this suffering? For the most part, the advice we get on finding a way out of suffering is to look for sensual pleasure. But those pleasures last only so long and we find ourselves suffering again. There's a back and forth. You hold on to the pleasure and you suddenly find yourself holding on to pain. As in Ajahn Chah's image, there's a snake with teeth on one end and no teeth on the other. You think it's safe to touch the end that has no teeth, but if you do, you find out that they're connected. Some people find that the pursuit of sensual pleasures is ignoble. In other words, it lowers the status of the mind. And by sensuality here, we mean not only the actual pleasures themselves, but more our fascination with fantasizing about them. That's what we tend to go to first when there's pain, but we find that that pulls the mind down. There are some people who say, well, maybe pain purifies the mind. The Buddha himself, as part of his quest, had a vision where he saw different kinds of wood. There was sappy wood that was soaking in water and that wasn't going to be useful to start a fire. There was sappy wood that was taken out of the water, but the fact that it was still sappy and moist meant that you couldn't start a fire with that either. Then there was dry wood far from the water that could be used to start a fire. So he interpreted that image to mean that he had to get away from pleasure entirely. And it's a common occurrence. Think about all the indulgence he had as a young man. When people tire of that indulgence or they find that they lack self-respect for that indulgence, they often swing to the opposite extreme. It was only after going through both extremes that he found the middle way. Now, the middle way was not a halfway feeling or a middling feeling. It involved another way of getting away from pain and suffering apart from sensual pleasure, and that was the pleasure of the mind and concentration. That was one of the first factors of the path, that he discovered a sense of ease and rapture that comes when the mind is secluded from sensuality. It's a pleasure of form. We're inhabiting the body from the inside. We're finding pleasure in balancing the elements in the body, starting with the breath, because that's the element most responsive to our intentions. When the Buddha contemplated this pleasure before he started on the path, he asked himself, why am I afraid of this pleasure that doesn't have any drawbacks? Is it unskillful? Is it blameworthy? He could see that there's nothing blameworthy about it. You're not harming anybody by sitting here breathing, getting sensitive to your breath. And you're also not clouding the mind. This is why part of the description is secluded from sensuality, secluded from unskillful mental states. You're not thinking about sensual pleasures at all. There are no fantasies about tomorrow's meal. If there are, it's not part of the concentration. You're trying to lift the quality of the mind because, after all, how are you going to understand sensuality unless you can step outside of it? And how can you step outside of it unless you have an alternative form of pleasure? As the Buddha said, if you don't have this form of pleasure, the pleasure of form or something higher, then no matter how much you may see the drawbacks of sensuality, you're still going to go back. Because the mind needs pleasure. It's part of its food. So supply it with a pleasure that's apart from sensuality, one in which you can look at your sensual clinging and sensual craving from the outside and not automatically side with these things. When the Buddha describes his analysis of suffering and the cause of suffering as noble truths, some people complain. They say, what's noble about suffering? What's noble about craving? They in themselves are not noble. What's noble is the way the Buddha analyzes them. And what's noble about that is that his analysis forces you to stand back from these things. Of the different forms of clinging and craving, sensual clinging and sensual craving have no role on the path at all. The other forms of clinging and craving, however, do have a role. As you're getting the mind into concentration, it's based on a desire for becoming You're trying to give rise to a state in the mind and trying to annihilate any other mental states that come up. So craving for becoming and craving for non-becoming do play a role as you're trying to master the skills of concentration. The same with clinging. There's no role for sensual clinging on the path, but there is a role for habits and practices. You've got the habits of the precepts and you've got the practices of concentration, views right view, and even a sense of self of someone who's capable of doing this and will benefit from doing it. Those forms of clinging do play a role on the path. But you notice that when the Buddha talks about when you gain right view or hear right view for the first time, you start thinking about what the implications are, and you realize that any thinking that's going to pull you into sensuality is something that you've got to say no to. That's the first right resolve. So in order to strengthen yourself, to strengthen your ability to step back from sensuality and to see it for what it is, you've got to have this alternative pleasure. This applies not only in right concentration, but also right mindfulness, because the two are actually parts of the same process. Right mindfulness is how you get the mind into right concentration. Think of the Buddha's images. When you're practicing right mindfulness, you're like that quail in the field that's been newly plowed. The stones are all turned up and it can hide behind the stones if a hawk comes after it. If it wanders outside of the field, it's easy prey. Outside of the field is what the 5 strings of sensuality. Which means that when you're engaged in mindfulness practice, it's not a matter of just watching whatever comes up good, bad, indifferent, sensual, non-sensual. You're actively placing a fence around the mind. It's going to stay here with the body in and of itself and not wander off into sensual pleasures. As you get to do that more and more thoroughly, more and more consistently, the mind gets secluded from sensuality and goes into right concentration where sensuality plays no role. There you're able to find this alternative pleasure, the pleasure of inhabiting the body fully with a sense of the breath energy filling the body, a sense of ease filling the body. Then from there, you work up to the higher and higher levels of concentration. But it's right here where the Buddha gained awakening. He didn't gain awakening by indulging in sensual thoughts. He realized there was another alternative to pain, and he made it a central part of the path. You look at the factors for the path. Think back to when we chant them. The first 2 have to do with discernment, the next 3 have to do with virtue, and the last 3 have to do with concentration. Those last 3 are far longer than the others and are explained in a lot more detail. They really are the heart of the path. They're what makes the middle way because they provide a pleasure that keeps you from going back to sensual pleasures and that helps you not get immersed in pain. Even in a passage where the Buddha says some people have to practice more painfully than others, his definition of painful is a meditation theme putting a lot of energy into contemplating the body. But you also develop the 5 faculties, including right concentration, so you're not totally immersed in pain. Now there are sensual pleasures that are actually okay along the way. The Buddha notes that he doesn't say no to all sensual pleasures. He says, however, that you have to notice which kinds of pleasures that you indulge in have a bad effect on the mind and which ones have no bad effect on the mind. If they have a bad effect on the mind, you've got to avoid them. That means not only avoiding the pleasures, but also avoiding fantasizing about them. So again, you have to maintain this sense of well-being that comes from inhabiting the body, staying with the breath, working with the breath energies, if you're going to have any chance of pulling yourself out of sensuality and finding a noble truth inside the mind. This is what the Buddha's talking about when he talks about the middle way, a pleasure that's not on the continuum between self-torture and total indulgence. It's off the continuum. It's a different kind of pleasure entirely, what he calls pleasure not of the flesh. It's something we have to work to give rise to. It doesn't arise on its own, but as we give rise to it, we develop a lot of good qualities in the mind. This is another way in which this pleasure differs from sensual pleasure. Sensual pleasures you can enjoy without having to develop any special qualities, but to gain the pleasure of right concentration, you need mindfulness. You need alertness, discernment, tranquility, and insight, all of which are good qualities to exercise. That's one of the reasons why it's such a useful pleasure, why it's a special pleasure that should be actively pursued. You hear so much about the dangers of getting stuck in the pleasure of jhāna. The Buddha talks a little bit about that. His image is of a person who's got some sap on his hand. He grabs hold of a branch, his hand may stick to the branch because of the sap, but there are solvents to get rid of that sap. And it's a much better attachment than being attached to sensuality, because that kind of attachment can lead you to do all kinds of things that go against the path. Whereas the only problem with being attached to the pleasure of concentration is that you may hang out here too long unwilling to do further work, but that can be cured. In the meantime, it's a lot less harmful. So this is a pleasure to be actively pursued because it's good for the mind in so many ways. Secluded from sensuality. The description for a right concentration begins with the phrase that you're secluded from sensuality, secluded from unskillful qualities. Sensuality is defined as your fascination with thinking about sensual pleasures, planning for sensual pleasures. If you have any thoughts like that, just put them aside. Unskillful qualities are defined as any of the wrong path factors, beginning with wrong view up through wrong mindfulness. So if you're mindful of things that are not relevant to staying focused on the body in and of itself, if you're not mindful to put aside greed and distress with reference to the world, try to put those memories aside. Be mindful only of things that are relevant for what you're trying to do right now, which is to get the mind concentrated, get it still. There are times when it's easy to put those things aside, other times when it's hard. This is why when the Buddha was teaching his son about breath meditation, he didn't start out with breath meditation. He started out with other contemplations, one of which was trying to make your mind like earth. Good and bad things get poured on the earth, but the earth doesn't get excited, doesn't get upset. Make your mind like water. Water can be used to wash away disgusting things, but the water itself doesn't get disgusted. In other words, you want to learn how to be with things as they happen without recoiling, without running away from them. The purpose here is not just to accept them. You make the mind as non-reactive as possible to serve an agenda so that you can see what's actually going on. Remember, when the Buddha teaches breath meditation, it's pretty proactive. You're going to be breathing in certain ways, trying to induce certain mind states, certain feelings, certain states of awareness by the way you breathe. But to prepare the mind for that activity, you have to make it as impassive as possible, so that when anything undesirable comes up in your meditation, you don't get excited about it. You don't get upset. You have to see it clearly if you want to deal with it skillfully. Why do you go for that? What's the appeal? Why do you want to lust? Another contemplation the Buddha recommends is the Brahmavihāras, starting with goodwill for all. Another is contemplation of the body. This is the main center of our thoughts for sensuality. It's because we're attracted to our body that we get attracted to other people. So the Buddha has you dissect your attraction to your body first. This is why we have that chant on the 32 parts of the body, not to say that the body is bad, but basically to say, why get all stirred up about it? Why look at it as an object of sensual desire? It has its uses. Without the body, you wouldn't be able to sit here meditating. But it has also its abuses. You get focused on sensual pleasures related to the body, and they can pull the mind away from concentration. As you approach meditation topics like this, it's always important to keep the third noble truth in mind. There is the possibility that you can totally end suffering. Without that possibility, you can say, I'll just go for whatever pleasures I like. Some people like sensuality, other people like a quiet state of mind. It sounds like it's just a matter of personal preference. But when the total end of suffering is an option, you want to reorder your values, spending your time rearranging your thoughts, rearranging your plans around something like this. You'll be attacking not so much the body, but the state of mind that wants to go for the pleasure and thinking about different sensual pleasures around the body, and then planning them. To focus attention on the mind state, we first have to take apart the object. Is it really worth it? This is where they talk about taking off the skin, putting it in a pile and seeing what you have left. It's not that much. There's a very thin layer of skin around the body that makes it something you can actually look at. Without that layer, you'd run away. Yet the skin itself, if you put it in a pile, wouldn't be attractive either. Then you take the rest of the body apart piece by piece. You can't have a body without a liver, you can't have one without intestines, but are you really attracted to the liver, attracted to the intestines? No. Try any way of contemplating the body taken apart, thinking about its dissolution as it gets older, what it's going to be like when it dies, to make you see that the object isn't worth all the sensual plans we make around it. Yet, you find the mind still wants to go for it. Ajahn Mahabua talks about how he got really good at taking the body apart in his mind. All he had to do was look at somebody, and immediately he'd see the flesh falling off covered with blood, the bones disintegrating. Yet he found that there was still the potential for lust in his mind. So instead of continuing to focus on the body, he started focusing on the mind. Why is it the mind can see all these things, admit all these facts, all these truths about the body, and yet still consciously ignore them? This is a tendency of the mind in general. When you want to go for something you know is unskillful, you block out any thoughts that would criticize what you're going for. It's why we can get very narrow in our focus. This is what becoming is all about. You have a desire, then you have the world around that desire, and in order to pursue that desire, sometimes you have to make it a very narrow world where your role in that world is very narrow as well. Why do you go for that? What's the appeal? Why do you want to lust? It's not the case that you're sitting here perfectly still, perfectly innocent, and something comes along and provokes lust. Most of the time, we're out looking for things to stir up our lust, our anger, and all the other unskillful desires we have. Why is that? What's the appeal? Where is it located? The Buddha talks about how the appeal can be located in any of the aggregates, such as your perceptions around lust, your perceptions around your relationship to the other person, your role in getting involved. Sometimes it's located in your thinking, the story you're telling yourself. Sometimes it's in the feelings that come up. Where is the appeal located? Then think about all the damage that can be done if you give in to these mind states, all the affliction that comes, and the fact that you're cutting off the possibility of nibbana, yet the appeal is such a little tiny thing. That particular mind state that becoming you develop around lust and sensuality has to block out the possibility that there could be an end to suffering. Otherwise, you'd see how ridiculous this is and what a waste of time. One of the best ways of looking at these issues is to recognize that you're just wasting your time here, and you don't know how much time you have. We have this human birth, and if we don't use it well, we fall. So this is a chance to grow up. Why throw it away? One of the main reasons you keep throwing it away is that you don't believe it's possible to put an end to suffering, or you don't want it to be possible. You have to look at all these possibilities. It's a mental issue. You focus first on the body to see that there's nothing much there so that you can focus your attention on what's going on in the mind. There's that experiment I mentioned before. They put a male pigeon in a box with a female pigeon and measured how much time it would take for him to start his mating dance. Then they took the female pigeon out and put a male pigeon in her place, clocked him again. It took a little bit longer, but eventually he started to make his mating dance toward the male. Then they took the male pigeon out and put a decoy in. It took him a little bit longer, but eventually he started the mating dance. They took the decoy out and then they put in other objects in making them less and less like pigeons, One of them was a red rubber ball, and although it took him a little bit longer each time, he could still work up his mating dance. Finally, they took the ball out to see what he would do with an empty box. He focused on a corner and started to do his mating dance toward the corner. That tells you a lot about the mind, and not just about a pigeon's mind. The human mind is like that too. It can manage to get itself worked up over anything. To what purpose? What's accomplished? What are the consequences? These are some of the things you tend to block out of your mind when you start indulging in fantasies like this. The consequences disappear in that world of becoming. But then, is that the way the real world works? No lust has its consequences. And the consequences that come, the afflictions that come with lust, are pretty strong. Then you contemplate that here you are cutting off the possibility of the third and fourth noble truths, that suffering can be ended, and there's a path to accomplish that. You could be spending your time on that path rather than wandering off into the woods getting entangled in the underbrush. To see how sensuality has its drawbacks, remember the Buddha's graduated discourse. He starts with generosity, with virtue, and with the rewards that come from developing these qualities in your mind. Then he has you think about the drawbacks. You get to the sensual levels of heaven, but then you fall. You get carried away with your instantaneous sensual pleasures, and the integrity of the mind begins to erode. You get used to having whatever sensual pleasure you want. You think about it, and there it is. You can imagine what kind of bad habits you develop in a situation like that. Then you get dropped down, and you have to start all over again. Think about how many lifetimes, how many eons you've been going through this. So try to get out of the tunnel vision that comes with sensuality and look at the larger context in terms of rebirth, in terms of the noble truths, particularly the third noble truth. There is that promise. One of the great ironies of Buddhism coming to the West is the accusation that Buddhism is pessimistic because it focuses on suffering. But that's just the first noble truth. The important truth is the third. It is possible to put an end to suffering. That's about as optimistic as you can get, but it challenges the becomings, the worldviews that we have that would block that possibility. So here's the Buddha saying, here's the path, and it goes to a really amazing place where you can actually step outside of time, step outside of space where it's totally free. Wouldn't you rather go there? Mental absorption, Jhāna Sutta, N4 123 inches. Monks, there are these 4 types of individuals to be found existing in the world. Which 4? There is the case where an individual quite secluded from sensuality, secluded from unskillful qualities, enters and remains in the first jhāna, rapture and pleasure born of seclusion, accompanied by directed thought and evaluation. He savors that, longs for that, finds satisfaction through that. Staying there fixed on that, dwelling there, often not falling away from that. Then when he dies, he reappears in conjunction with the devas of Brahma's retinue. The devas of Brahma's retinue monks have a lifespan of an eon. A run-of-the-mill person, having stayed there, having used up all the lifespan of those devas, goes to hell, to the animal womb, to the state of the hungry ghosts. But a disciple of the Blessed One, having stayed there, having used up all the lifespan of those devas, is unbound right in that state of being. This, monks, is the difference, the distinction, the distinguishing factor between an educated disciple of the noble ones and an uneducated run-of-the-mill person when there is a destination, a reappearing. Again, there is the case where an individual with the stilling of directed thoughts and evaluations enters and remains in the second jhāna, rapture, and pleasure born of concentration, unification of awareness, free from directed thought and evaluation, internal assurance. He savors that, longs for that, finds satisfaction through that. Staying there fixed on that dwelling, they're often not falling away from that. Then, when he dies, he reappears in conjunction with the Abhasara, radiant Deva. 1. The Abhasara Devas monks have a lifespan of 2 eons. A run-of-the-mill person having stayed there, having used up all the lifespan of those devas, goes to hell, to the animal womb, to the state of the hungry ghosts. But a disciple of the Blessed One, having stayed there, having used up all the lifespan of those devas, is unbound right in that state of being. This, monks, is the difference, the distinction, the distinguishing factor between an educated disciple of the noble ones and an uneducated run-of-the-mill person when there is a destination, a reappearing. Again, there is the case where an individual with the fading of rapture remains equanimous, mindful and alert senses, pleasure with the body, and enters and remains in the third jhāna, of which the noble ones declare, equanimous and mindful, he has a pleasant abiding. He savors that, longs for that, finds satisfaction through that. Staying there fixed on that dwelling, there, often not falling away from that, then when he dies, he reappears in conjunction with the Subhakina, beautiful black diva. The Subhakina diva monks have a lifespan of 4 eons. A run-of-the-mill person having stayed there, having used up all the lifespan of those devas, goes to hell, to the animal womb, to the state of the hungry ghosts. But a disciple of the Blessed One, having stayed there, having used up all the lifespan of those devas, is unbound right in that state of being. This, monks, is the difference, the distinction, the distinguishing factor between an educated disciple of the noble ones and an uneducated run-of-the-mill person when there is a destination, a reappearing. Again, there is the case where an individual with the abandoning of pleasure and pain, as with the earlier disappearance of elation and distress, enters and remains in the 4th jhāna purity of equanimity and mindfulness, neither pleasure nor pain. He savors that, longs for that, finds satisfaction through that. Staying there fixed on that dwelling, there, often not falling away from that, then when he dies, he reappears in conjunction with the Vihapala, sky fruit devas. The Vihapala devas, monks, have a lifespan of 500 eons. A run-of-the-mill person having stayed there, having used up all the lifespan of those devas, goes to hell, to the animal womb, to the state of the hungry ghosts. But a disciple of the Blessed One, having stayed there, having used up all the lifespan of those devas, is unbound right in that state of being. This, monks, is the difference, the distinction, the distinguishing factor between an educated disciple of the noble ones and an uneducated run-of-the-mill person when there is a destination, a reappearing. These are 4 types of individuals to be found existing in the world.